At 10:20 on the morning of June 4, 1942, American dive bombers screamed down from 14,000 feet above the Pacific Ocean. In 5 minutes, the entire course of the Second World War would change forever. 3 Japanese aircraft carriers, the pride of the most powerful naval striking force on Earth, erupted in walls of flame that could be seen for miles across the open sea. Fuel and bombs stacked on their hangar decks detonated in cascading fireballs that sent columns of black smoke thousands of feet into the sky. Sailors aboard nearby destroyers shielded their eyes from the blinding explosions. The screech of twisting metal mixed with the roar of burning aviation fuel as the mighty ships that had terrorized the Pacific for 6 months began their death spirals toward the bottom of the ocean. But this was not a lucky strike. This was not a fortunate accident of war. This was an ambush, calculated down to the minute, the bearing, and the mile. And it had all started weeks earlier, in a windowless basement beneath the headquarters building at Pearl Harbor, where a man in carpet slippers and a smoking jacket was reading Japan's most closely guarded secrets. This is the story of how Admiral Chester Nimitz outplayed Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto with a single intercepted message, and how a handful of exhausted codebreakers changed the fate of the world. To understand what happened at Midway, you first have to understand the man who made it possible. Commander Joseph John Rochefort was born on May 12, 1900, the son of a working-class family. He had dropped out of high school to enlist in the United States Navy in 1918, but the Navy quickly recognized something unusual about the young sailor. He had an extraordinary talent for pattern recognition, the kind of mind that could solve complex puzzles while others were still reading the instructions. He was selected for advanced training in cryptanalysis, the science of breaking secret codes, and in 1929 he was sent to Tokyo for 3 years to learn the Japanese language. He became fluent not just in Japanese, but in the way the Imperial Japanese Navy thought. He understood their traditions, their doctrine, their habits. He could read between the lines of their communications because he understood the men who wrote them. By the spring of 1942, Rochefort was the officer in charge of Station Hypo, the combat intelligence unit of the 14th Naval District at Pearl Harbor. His team worked in the basement of the old administration building, a windowless, air-conditioned dungeon that his men simply called the dungeon. Rochefort had hand-picked every member of the team. Lieutenant Commander Thomas Dyer, a brilliant cryptanalyst who had pioneered the use of IBM tabulating machines to attack enemy codes, and who kept a sign on his desk that read, "You don't have to be crazy to work here, but it helps." Lieutenant Commander Wesley Ham Wright, considered one of the finest mathematical minds in American naval intelligence. And Lieutenant Commander Wilfred Jasper Holmes, a former submariner who had been medically retired in 1936 because of severe arthritis, then recalled to active duty after Pearl Harbor. Holmes ran the tracking and intelligence plotting section. He was also a published fiction writer who had once written submarine adventure novels under the pen name Alec Hudson. These men and their colleagues worked 18 to 22-hour days, surviving on coffee and sandwiches brought down to the basement. The air conditioning kept the room cold enough that Rochefort wore a smoking jacket over his khaki uniform and shuffled around in carpet slippers because he rarely left the dungeon long enough to bother with proper shoes. Their target was JN-25, the Imperial Japanese Navy's General Operational Code. It was a fiendishly complex system built on 2 layers of encryption. First, a codebook containing roughly 45,000 5-digit number groups, each representing a word or phrase. Then, a second book of random additive numbers that were applied on top of the code groups to disguise them further. Breaking it required not just mathematical genius, but an almost intuitive understanding of language, context, and the habits of Japanese radio operators. By May of 1942, Rochefort's team was processing between 500 and 1,000 intercepted messages every day and producing roughly 140 translations. They could read perhaps 10 to 40% of any given message, enough to extract fragments of meaning, never enough to read clean text from beginning to end. It was like trying to read a novel through a keyhole, catching a word here, a phrase there, and assembling the story from the pieces. The Japanese had been scheduled to change their code keys on April 1st, 1942. Had they done so, the entire American effort would have gone dark. But the chaos of Japan's rapid military expansion across Southeast Asia and the Pacific had created administrative confusion. The code change was postponed to May 1, then again to late May. That delay, a simple bureaucratic failure, would prove to be the most consequential operational security mistake of the entire Pacific War. In April of 1942, the world was looking very dark for the United States and its allies. Just 5 months after the devastating surprise attack on Pearl Harbor, Japan controlled a vast empire stretching from the borders of India to the islands of the Central Pacific. The British fortress of Singapore had fallen, the Dutch East Indies had been conquered, the Philippines were in their final agony, with the garrison on Corregidor about to surrender. Japanese forces had pushed into Burma and were threatening Australia. The Imperial Japanese Navy seemed invincible. Its carrier striking force, the Kaido Butai, had rampaged across the Pacific and Indian Oceans without suffering a single serious defeat. From Pearl Harbor to Darwin to Ceylon, every opponent had been brushed aside with contemptuous ease. The American position in the Pacific was desperate. After Pearl Harbor, the United States had only 4 operational fleet carriers in the entire ocean. The battleship fleet that had been the backbone of American naval power lay broken on the muddy bottom of Pearl Harbor. American forces were fighting a holding action, buying time for the industrial might of the nation to produce the ships, planes, and trained men needed to go on the offensive. No one knew when that day would come, or whether the Japanese would strike a knockout blow before it arrived. But Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, Commander-in-Chief of Japan's combined fleet, was not a man who believed in waiting. He understood America better than most of his countrymen. He had studied at Harvard University. He had served as a naval attaché in Washington. He had traveled across the American heartland and seen the factories, the oil fields, and the sheer scale of the nation's industrial capacity. He had warned Japan's leaders before the war that he could run wild for the first 6 months or a year, but that he had utterly no confidence for the 2nd and 3rd years of a prolonged conflict. He knew that time was Japan's enemy. Every month that passed brought more American ships, more American planes, more American-trained pilots into the Pacific. The window of Japanese superiority was closing. The Doolittle raid on April 18, 1942, when 16 B-25 bombers launched from the carrier Hornet and struck Tokyo itself, had been a psychological earthquake. The physical damage was minor, but the shock of American bombs falling on the sacred homeland of the Emperor was intolerable. Yamamoto seized on the raid to force through a plan he had been developing for weeks. He would lure the remaining American carriers into a decisive battle and destroy them. The bait would be Midway Atoll, a tiny pair of islands roughly 1,300 miles northwest of Hawaii. Midway was strategically vital as an outpost guarding the approaches to Hawaii itself. Yamamoto calculated that the Americans would have to defend it, and when they came out to fight, his overwhelmingly superior fleet would crush them. Operation MI, as Yamamoto designated the plan, was breathtaking in its ambition and complexity. More than 200 ships would be committed, including 8 aircraft carriers, 11 battleships, 22 cruisers, 65 destroyers, and 21 submarines. The centerpiece was the Kaido Butai, 4 fleet carriers under Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, the same force that had devastated Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier. The carriers Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu carried approximately 248 aircraft crewed by some of the most experienced naval aviators in the world. Behind Nagumo trailed the main body under Yamamoto himself, built around the monstrous super battleship Yamato, the largest warship ever constructed, accompanied by the battleships Nagato and Mutsu. A separate invasion force of transports carried 5,000 troops to seize Midway once the American fleet had been destroyed. And to confuse the Americans further, a diversionary force, including the light carrier Ryujo and the converted carrier Junyo, along with supporting ships, would attack Dutch Harbor in the Aleutian Islands of Alaska and seize the remote islands of Attu and Kiska. It was, on paper, an overwhelming force, but it contained a fatal flaw that Yamamoto could not see. His forces were scattered across thousands of miles of ocean in widely separated groups that could not support one another. The main body trailed Nagumo's carriers by more than 300 nautical miles. The Aleutian force operated 1,500 miles to the north. The submarine cordon meant to detect American carriers leaving Pearl Harbor would arrive on station too late, after the American ships had already passed through. And most critically, the entire plan rested on a single assumption that the Americans would be surprised. They would not be surprised. because in the dungeon beneath Pearl Harbor, Joseph Rochefort was reading Yamamoto's mail. Through April and into May of 1942, JN-25 traffic began buzzing with references to a forthcoming major operation. Rochefort's team picked up fragments mentioning fleet tanker assignments, carrier division staging from the Hashirajima anchorage, the embarkation of a special naval landing force, and repeated references to an objective designated by the two-letter code group, AF. A second designator, MI, appeared attached to the overall operation. Fragment by fragment, intercept by intercept, Rochefort's analysts began assembling the picture. They identified the basic composition of the striking force. 4 carriers under Nagumo. They identified the invasion force. They identified the diversionary operation against the Aleutians. They identified the submarine cordons. And they became convinced, based on earlier traffic analysis linking AF to Midway in a Japanese flying boat reconnaissance report from March, that AF was Midway Atoll. But not everyone agreed. In Washington, the Navy's code-breaking headquarters, OP-20G, was run by Commander John Redman, a communications officer with no cryptanalytic training who had recently displaced the experienced Captain Laurence Safford. Redman and his staff disagreed with Rochefort's assessment. They argued that AF could be the Aleutian Islands, or Hawaii itself, or Johnston Island, or even a target on the American West Coast. The Army's intelligence branch was even more certain that the blow would fall on California or Oregon. Admiral Ernest King, the Commander-in-Chief of the United States Fleet in Washington, was inclined toward the Washington assessment. Admiral Chester Nimitz, commanding the Pacific Fleet from Pearl Harbor, was inclined toward Rochefort, but inclination was not enough. The fate of the Pacific Fleet, and perhaps the entire war, hung on whether AF meant Midway or somewhere else entirely. The wrong answer would mean sending the few remaining American carriers into empty ocean while the Japanese struck an undefended target. Nimitz needed proof. The proof came from Jasper Holmes, and it came in the form of one of the most elegant deceptions in military history. Holmes knew Midway Atoll intimately from his years of service in the Pacific. He knew that the tiny coral islands had no natural fresh water. The Marine garrison stationed there depended entirely on a seawater distillation plant to produce drinking water. If Midway could be made to broadcast an uncoded, plain language message complaining that its distillation plant had broken down and that fresh water was urgently needed, the Japanese monitoring stations would intercept it. And if the Japanese then reported in their own coded traffic that AF was experiencing a water shortage, the identification would be confirmed beyond any doubt. Holmes proposed the idea to Rochefort. Rochefort took it to Lieutenant Commander Edwin Layton, the Pacific Fleet's chief intelligence officer and Rochefort's closest ally on Nimitz's staff. Layton and Rochefort had known each other since the 1920s, when they had been classmates in the Japanese language program in Tokyo. They trusted each other completely. Layton took the proposal directly to Nimitz. Nimitz approved immediately. The instructions were sent to Midway not by radio, which the Japanese might intercept, but by the secure undersea cable that connected Pearl Harbor directly to the atoll. Captain Cyril Simard, the Midway garrison commander, was told to broadcast in plain English an emergency report that the distillation plant had failed and that fresh water was urgently needed. Pearl Harbor cooperated by sending a plain language reply that a water barge would be dispatched. The bait was cast on May 19, 1942. Within roughly 24 hours, Station Hypo intercepted a JN-25 message originating from the Japanese reporting unit on Wake Island, addressed up the chain of command, advising that AF was experiencing a fresh water shortage and that the invasion force should carry additional desalting equipment and water provisions. The message was decrypted on May 20th or 21st. AF was Midway. There was no longer any room for doubt. In the days that followed, Rochefort's team achieved another breakthrough. Lieutenant Joseph Finnegan cracked the date and time superencipherment applied to a May 26th intercept ordering destroyer escort movements. M-Day, the date of the attack, was fixed as either June 4 or June 5, 1942. By May 27th, Layton was able to brief Nimitz with astonishing precision. He predicted that the Japanese carriers would be sighted on the morning of June 4, approaching from the northwest on a bearing of 325 degrees, at a range of approximately 175 nautical miles from Midway, at roughly 0600 hours local time. The accuracy of that prediction would become legendary. Nimitz now faced the most consequential decision of his career. He had 3 operational fleet carriers available. Enterprise and Hornet, forming Task Force 16, had just returned from the South Pacific. Their normal commander, Vice Admiral William Halsey, was hospitalized with a severe skin condition and could not sail. Halsey recommended his cruiser commander, Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance, as his replacement. Spruance was a surface warfare officer with no carrier experience, but Halsey trusted him, and so did Nimitz. The third carrier was Yorktown, flagship of Rear Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher's Task Force 17. Yorktown had been badly damaged at the Battle of the Coral Sea on May 8, when a 551-pound bomb had penetrated her flight deck, exploded above the forward engine room, destroyed 6 watertight compartments, and killed or wounded 66 crewmen. She had limped home to Pearl Harbor, trailing a 10-mile oil slick. Initial estimates called for 90 days in dry dock for proper repairs, or 2 weeks at the bare minimum. Nimitz stood in dry dock number 1 at Pearl Harbor, looked at the battered carrier, and told Captain Claude Gillette, the yard superintendent, that he needed this ship back in 3 days. Roughly 1,400 yard workers swarmed over Yorktown around the clock, 24 hours a day. They ate sandwiches on the job and slept on deck plates where they fell. Her superheater boilers were never fully repaired, limiting her top speed to roughly 27 knots, but she had a flight deck, and that was enough. Yorktown completed her emergency repairs and sailed on May 30th with a hastily assembled air group built largely from the carrier Saratoga's squadrons. On May 27th, Nimitz issued his Operations Plan 29-42. It instructed Fletcher and Spruance to proceed to a rendezvous point northeast of Midway designated Point Luck and to inflict maximum damage on the enemy by employing strong attrition tactics. The accompanying letter contained a formulation that has become one of the most famous orders in American naval history. Nimitz told his commanders they would be governed by the principle of calculated risk, meaning they should avoid exposing their forces to attack by superior enemy forces without a good prospect of inflicting greater damage on the enemy in return. Nimitz was committing 75% of the Pacific Fleet's available carrier strength to an ambush against a numerically superior enemy. If he was wrong, the Pacific War could be lost. Nimitz also rushed reinforcements to Midway itself. Every available aircraft was funneled to the tiny atoll. Marine Fighter Squadron 221 received additional F-2, 3 Buffalo fighters, and a few precious F-4, F-3 Wildcats. Marine Scout Bombing Squadron 241 was reinforced with SB, D-2 Dauntless dive bombers and the older SB-2 U-3 Vindicators, which the Marines grimly nicknamed Wind Indicators because they were so slow they seemed to fly backward. 31 PBY Catalina flying boats arrived to extend the search perimeter hundreds of miles in every direction. 19 B-17E Flying Fortress, heavy bombers from the Army Air Forces deployed to the island. 4 B-26 Marauder medium bombers were modified to carry aerial torpedoes, a weapon most of their crews had never trained with. Additional coastal defense guns, anti-aircraft batteries, and ground troops reinforced the garrison. Midway was being turned into a stationary aircraft carrier, an unsinkable platform that would add its air power to the ambush. Task Forces 16 and 17 rendezvoused at Point Luck on June 2, 1942. Fletcher assumed tactical command of the combined striking force. The American carriers waited, hidden northeast of Midway, well clear of the Japanese submarine cordon that had arrived on station too late to detect them. Nimitz remained at Pearl Harbor, monitoring the situation from his headquarters. He had done everything within his power. He had trusted his codebreakers, reinforced his target, positioned his carriers, and given his commanders the latitude to fight as they saw fit. Now the outcome rested in the hands of the men at sea. The trap was set. Yamamoto did not know he was sailing into an ambush. His intelligence had failed him at every level. He believed the Americans had only 2 operational carriers, Enterprise and Hornet. He assumed Yorktown had been sunk at the Coral Sea, when in fact she was steaming toward Midway with her patched-up flight deck and borrowed air group. A planned reconnaissance flight by Japanese flying boats over Pearl Harbor, Operation K, had been cancelled because American forces had occupied the refueling point at French frigate Shoals. The submarine picket lines had arrived too late. And most critically, when shore-based intelligence in Tokyo belatedly suspected in early June that the Americans might have advanced knowledge of the Midway operation. The warning message was never relayed to Nagumo. Yamamoto's staff aboard the super battleship Yamato, observing strict radio silence, assumed that Nagumo's flagship Akagi had received the warning independently. Akagi's radio receivers were inferior to Yamato's, and Nagumo never got the message. At 04:30 on the morning of June 4, 1942, Nagumo launched 108 aircraft against Midway. 36 Zero fighters, 36 Val dive bombers, and 36 Kate-level bombers struck the atoll's installations at 06:30. Marine fighters from VMF 221, flying hopelessly outclassed F-2, A-3 Buffaloes, and a handful of F-4, F-3 Wildcats, rose to intercept and were slaughtered. 15 of 25 Marine fighters were shot down. The strike leader, Lieutenant Joichi Tomonaga, radioed back to Nagumo that a second attack on Midway was needed to finish the job. And then, at 06:03, a Navy PBY Catalina patrol plane piloted by Ensign Howard Adey sent the contact report that validated everything Rochefort's team had predicted. 2 carriers and battleships, bearing 320 degrees, course 135, speed 25, distance 180 miles. Nimitz looked at Leighton and said, with dry understatement, that Leighton had only been off by 5 minutes, 5 degrees and 5 miles. What followed was one of the most dramatic and costly mornings in the history of naval warfare. Midway-based aircraft struck first. 6 TB-F Avengers of Torpedo Squadron 8's Midway Detachment under Lieutenant Langdon Fieberling and 4 B-26 Marauders armed with torpedoes attacked the Kaido Butai between 07:10 and 07:20. 5 of the 6 Avengers and 2 of the 4 Marauders were shot down without scoring a single hit. Marine dive bombers under Major Lofton Henderson, who was killed leading the attack, followed with more attacks. B-17 heavy bombers dropped their loads from 20,000 feet. Not a single bomb or torpedo found its mark. But these attacks created the crisis that would destroy Nagumo. At 07:15, in response to Tomonaga's request for a second Midway strike, and alarmed by the continuing American attacks from land-based aircraft, Nagumo issued a fateful order. He commanded his hangar crews to rearm the reserve strike force, aircraft that had been held back with torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs for use against enemy ships, and switch them to land-attack fragmentation bombs for a second strike on Midway. Crews began the dangerous, time-consuming process of swapping ordnance in the hot, cramped hangar decks of the 4 carriers. Then, at 07:40, the scout float plane from the cruiser Tone, launched 30 minutes late because of a faulty catapult, finally radioed a contact report. Enemy ships sighted, bearing 010 degrees, distance 240 miles from Midway. Nagumo demanded clarification. What kind of ships? At 08:09, the scout reported 5 cruisers and 5 destroyers. At 08:20, the scout added the words that changed everything. The enemy force appeared to include a carrier. Nagumo now faced an impossible dilemma. His hangar decks were cluttered with aircraft in mid-rearm, bombs and torpedoes lying out of their magazines. His first strike planes were returning from Midway, low on fuel. His flight decks were needed to recover them. He chose to recover the Midway strike, fully rearm and refuel all aircraft, and then launch a coordinated maximum-strength counterstrike against the American carrier. It was standard Japanese carrier doctrine, and it would have been a sound decision under normal circumstances. But these were not normal circumstances, because the American carriers were already launching. Spruance had ordered his aircraft aloft at extreme range, beginning around 0700, a calculated gamble that catching Nagumo with his decks full would be worth the risk of disorganized attacks and aircraft running out of fuel. The torpedo squadrons found the Japanese first, and they paid a price that defies comprehension. Torpedo Squadron 8. From the carrier Hornet, 15 Douglas TBD Devastator torpedo bombers under Lieutenant Commander John Waldron attacked at approximately 0920 with no fighter cover whatsoever. Waldron had broken formation with the rest of the Hornet Air Group, which was flying on an incorrect heading, and had led his squadron directly to the enemy on instinct and determination alone. Before the launch, Waldron had written to his pilots in a mimeographed message that if only one plane was left, he wanted that man to go in and get a hit. Every single one of the 15 devastators was shot down. Of the 30 men who launched with Torpedo 8 from Hornet that morning, 29 were killed. The sole survivor, Ensign George Tex Gay, floated in the water amid the wreckage and watched the rest of the battle unfold around him. Torpedo Squadron 6 from Enterprise attacked next, 14 devastators under Lieutenant Commander Eugene Lindsay. 10 were shot down, including Lindsay's aircraft. No torpedo found its mark. Then came Torpedo Squadron 3 from Yorktown, 12 devastators under Lieutenant Commander Lance Massey, escorted by 6 Wildcat fighters, led by Lieutenant Commander John Jimmy Thach. 10 of the 12 torpedo planes were shot down, including Massey's. Again, not a single torpedo hit an enemy ship. Of 41 carrier-based devastators that attacked the Japanese fleet that morning, only 6 returned to their ships. Not one American torpedo struck home. The sacrifice seemed catastrophic, pointless, a slaughter without result. But it was not pointless. The torpedo attacks had achieved something that no one, not even the American commanders, had planned. By mid-morning, more than 40 Zero fighters of the Japanese Combat Air Patrol had been pulled down to sea level to slaughter the low and slow torpedo bombers. They had expended fuel and ammunition. They were completely out of position. And high above the Japanese fleet, undetected, the dive bombers were arriving. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, leading 33 SBD Dauntless dive bombers from Enterprise, had flown to where the Japanese carriers should have been and found empty ocean. Nagumo had changed course to the northeast at 0917, and McCluskey's carefully calculated interception point was wrong. Fuel was running critically low. Many pilots would not have enough to return to their carrier. McCluskey made the decision that Nimitz later said decided the fate of the carrier task force and the forces at Midway. At 0955, he spotted the Japanese destroyer Arashi steaming north at full speed, trailing a white wake across the blue Pacific. Arashi was racing to rejoin the main fleet after depth charging the American submarine Nautilus. McCluskey followed the destroyer's wake like a road sign pointing straight to the enemy. At approximately 10:20, he sighted the Japanese carriers. Through a communications confusion, both of McCluskey's squadrons initially dove on the same target, the carrier Kaga. Lieutenant Richard Best, leading Bombing Squadron 6, recognized the error. He pulled out of his dive with his 2 wingmen and redirected to the next carrier in line, the flagship Akagi. At nearly the same instant, 17 Dauntless dive bombers from Yorktown under Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie arrived overhead the carrier Soryu. Leslie had accidentally jettisoned his own bomb on the way in because of an electrical malfunction, but he led the dive anyway. In approximately 5 minutes, between 10:20 and 10:25, on the morning of June 4, 1942, the war in the Pacific changed forever. Kaga was struck by at least 4,000-pound bombs. Her flight deck and hangar decks erupted in flames that consumed fueled and armed aircraft. Her captain, Jisaku Okada, was killed on the bridge. She burned for 9 hours before being scuttled that evening. Roughly 811 of her crew perished. Akagi, Nagumo's flagship, was hit by Best's single 1,000-pound bomb amidships in the upper hangar deck. The blast ignited, fueled, and armed aircraft packed below. Uncontrollable fires raged through the ship. Nagumo transferred his flag to the light cruiser Nagara. Akagi was scuttled by her own destroyers in the early hours of June 5. Roughly 267 men were lost. Soryu took 3,000-pound bombs evenly spaced along her length. One penetrated to the lower hangar and disabled her engines. She was abandoned within 20 minutes. Her captain, Ryusaku Yanagimoto, refused to leave and died with his ship. Roughly 711 of her crew were killed. By 10:30 that morning, 75% of the Kido Butai was burning. The 4th carrier, Hiryu, had escaped the initial attack, screened by clouds. Her commander, Rear Admiral Tamon Yamaguchi, launched 2 desperate counterstrikes against the American fleet. The first wave of 18 Val dive bombers and 6 escorting Zeros, led by Lieutenant Michio Kobayashi, struck Yorktown at approximately noon. 3 bombs slammed into her, knocking out 5 of 9 boilers and leaving her dead in the water. Kobayashi himself was shot down and killed. The second wave of 10 Kate torpedo bombers and 6 escorting Zeros, led by Lieutenant Tomonaga himself, who, according to Japanese post-war accounts, knew he did not have enough fuel to return because his aircraft's wing tank had been damaged during the morning Midway strike, hit Yorktown again in the early afternoon. 2 torpedoes slammed into her port side, producing a 23-degree list. Tomonaga was shot down. Yorktown was abandoned at 1500 hours, but Hiryu's position was now known. At approximately 1700 hours, 24 dive bombers from Enterprise, including Yorktown aircraft that had landed aboard, found Hiryu and put 4,000-pound bombs into her forward flight deck. Her elevator was blown upward and thrown against the bridge. She burned through the night. Yamaguchi and his captain, Tomeo Kaku, chose to go down with their ship. After a final ceremony on the burning flight deck, where Yamaguchi reportedly told Kaku to enjoy the beauty of the moon, the surviving crew was evacuated. Hiryu was scuttled the following morning. All 4 carriers of the Kido Butai, the force that had attacked Pearl Harbor, that had swept through the Indian Ocean, that had seemed invincible, lay at the bottom of the Pacific. And the Japanese losses did not end with the carriers. During the retreat on June 5th, the heavy cruisers Mogami and Mikuma collided while evading the American submarine Tambor. Dive bombers from Enterprise and Hornet pursued them the following day. Mikuma was sunk with the loss of roughly 700 men. Mogami, heavily damaged, barely escaped. The final cost was devastating. Japan lost 4 fleet carriers, 1 heavy cruiser, approximately 248 aircraft, and roughly 3,057 men, including irreplaceable aircraft mechanics and maintenance specialists whose skills could never be adequately replaced. The loss of these highly trained technicians, men who understood the intricate systems of carrier aviation and had spent years perfecting their craft, was in some ways more devastating than the loss of the ships themselves. Ships could be rebuilt. The institutional knowledge carried by those 700 maintenance specialists could not be replicated by any shipyard or training program. The United States lost 1 carrier, Yorktown, and the destroyer Hammond. Yorktown had survived her initial damage and remained afloat through the night of June 4. On June 6, a salvage party reboarded the listing carrier, and the destroyer Hammond moored alongside to provide power and firefighting water. Later that same day, at 13:31 hours, the Japanese submarine I-168, commanded by Lieutenant Commander Yahachi Tanabe, fired a spread of 4 torpedoes. 1 struck Hammond amidships. The destroyer broke in 2 and sank in less than 4 minutes. As she plunged beneath the surface, her depth charges detonated, killing many of her own crew who were struggling in the water. 81 of Hammond's 241-man crew perished. 2 more torpedoes struck Yorktown. She survived through another night, but finally capsized and sank at 0701 on the morning of June 7, 1942, disappearing into more than 16,000 feet of water. Roughly 307 Americans were killed in the entire battle, including the men of the torpedo squadrons whose sacrifice had made the dive bomber attack possible. Yamamoto, aboard the super battleship Yamato 300 miles behind the battle, learned of the carrier disaster on the afternoon of June 4. He briefly considered forcing a night surface engagement with his battleships, but Spruance, who had assumed full tactical command after Fletcher's flagship was disabled, wisely withdrew east during the darkness, refusing to risk his carriers in a gunnery battle they could not win. Yamamoto ordered the entire operation cancelled in the early hours of June 5. The greatest naval force Japan had ever assembled turned around and sailed home in defeat. The Japanese government responded with denial and deception on a staggering scale. A public announcement declared a great victory in which 2 American carriers had been sunk. The loss of Japanese carriers was minimized and concealed. Wounded survivors were quarantined in isolated hospitals to prevent them from spreading the truth. Enlisted men were transferred to distant garrisons where they could not talk to journalists or family members. Akagi and Hiryu were quietly kept on the Navy's official roster as unmanned ships for months, as if they still existed and might one day return to service. Officers who had survived the battle were sworn to secrecy. The full scale of the catastrophe was hidden not only from the Japanese public, but from many officers within the military itself. Even members of the Naval General Staff in Tokyo were initially given misleading briefings about the extent of the losses. It was one of the most extensive cover-ups in Japanese military history, and it succeeded in concealing the truth for months. Midway was the turning point of the Pacific War. Japan lost the strategic initiative on June 4, 1942, and never recovered it. Before Midway, the Japanese had been on the offensive everywhere, choosing when and where to strike. After Midway, they were on the defensive, reacting to American moves. The veteran air crews that had trained for years before the war would be ground down over the following 18 months in the brutal air battles over Guadalcanal and the Solomon Islands. The Japanese lost more than 1,000 aircraft in the Solomons campaign alone. By the end of 1943, the pre-war elite of Japanese naval aviation was effectively destroyed. Meanwhile, American shipyards were producing new carriers at a pace Japan could never match. The Essex-class fleet carriers and Independence-class light carriers that would overwhelm Japan in 1944 and 1945 were already under construction. The war was far from over, but its outcome was no longer in doubt. Nimitz's assessment was characteristically understated. He called Midway essentially a victory of intelligence. But the story of signals, intelligence, and Yamamoto did not end at Midway. In April of 1943, less than a year after the battle, Yamamoto planned a personal inspection tour of forward bases in the Solomon Islands to boost morale among his airmen. His detailed itinerary, specifying exact departure times, arrival times, and aircraft types, was transmitted in JN-25D, the latest version of the Japanese Naval Code. The message was intercepted by American monitoring stations at Wahiawa in Hawaii, at Dutch Harbor in Alaska, and by additional Navy intercept facilities in the Pacific. It was decrypted at Fleet Radio Unit Pacific at Pearl Harbor. The decrypt revealed that on April 18, 1943, Yamamoto would depart Rabaul at 0600 Tokyo time and arrive at the airfield on Balale Island near Bougainville at 0800. He would be traveling in 2 Betty medium bombers of the 705th Air Group, escorted by 6 Zero fighters. Nimitz authorized the interception. 16 P-38, Lightning fighters of the 339th Fighter Squadron, the only American fighter with the range to make the 1,000 nautical mile round trip, took off from Guadalcanal on the morning of April 18. Major John Mitchell planned a circuitous, low-altitude approach to avoid detection. The P-38s arrived at the interception point off Bougainville at almost exactly the moment Yamamoto's flight appeared. In a brief, violent engagement, both Betty bombers were shot down. Yamamoto's aircraft crashed into the jungle near Buin. His body was found the next day, still strapped in his seat, holding his samurai sword. 2 .50 caliber bullets had struck him, one in the jaw and one in the shoulder. He had been killed instantly. The Japanese government concealed his death for over a month before announcing it publicly on May 21. The irony was absolute. The same intelligence weapon that had destroyed Yamamoto's fleet at Midway had now destroyed Yamamoto himself. Signals intelligence from JN-25 had given Nimitz the means to ambush the combined fleet in June of 1942. 11 months later, a later version of the same code gave Nimitz the means to ambush the man who commanded it. The Japanese Navy never realized that their codes had been broken. And what of the man who made it all possible? Joseph Rochefort's reward for the greatest intelligence triumph of the Pacific War was bureaucratic exile. The internal Navy rivalry between Station Hypo and OP-20G in Washington had been simmering for over a year. The Redman brothers, Captain Joseph Redman and Commander John Redman, who ran naval communications and code-breaking in Washington, had backed the wrong assessment of the AF designation. They had argued that Midway was not the target, and they resented that Rochefort had bypassed their authority to deliver intelligence directly to Nimitz through Layton. The water ruse had been conducted without Washington's approval. Nimitz nominated Rochefort for the Distinguished Service Medal in June of 1942. The recommendation was sent to Washington, where it was vetoed. The Redmans drafted memoranda crediting their own office with the intelligence success and persuaded Admiral King that Rochefort was insubordinate. In October of 1942, Rochefort was transferred out of Hypo. He was given command of a floating dry dock under construction in California and never returned to cryptanalysis. He later headed a planning section in Washington during 1944 and 45, retired as a captain, and died on July 20, 1976. For decades, he could not even speak about what he had done, because the secrets of JN-25 remained classified. The campaign to recognize Rochefort's contribution began in the late 1970s, led by his former colleagues, including Rear Admiral Donald Mack Showers, who had served as a junior watch officer in the dungeon. Rear Admiral Edwin Layton's memoir, published posthumously in 1985, finally laid out the full story of Station Hypo and the intelligence battle behind Midway. After a decade of lobbying, the Navy reversed itself. On May 30, 1986, in a ceremony at the White House, President Ronald Reagan posthumously presented the Distinguished Service Medal to Rochefort's daughter, Janet Rochefort Elleding, and his son, Joseph Rochefort Jr. The citation credited Rochefort with the code-breaking achievement that had made the victory at Midway possible. He was later inducted into the National Security Agency's Cryptologic Hall of Honor in the year 2000. The Battle of Midway was not won by superior numbers. The Americans were outgunned, outmanned, and outshipped at every level. It was not won by superior technology. The torpedo bombers that attacked first were obsolete death traps flying against the best fighters in the world. It was not won by luck, though luck played its part in McCluskey spotting the wake of a lone destroyer on an empty ocean. Midway was won by intelligence, by the grinding, unglamorous work of men in a basement who broke an enemy code and told their admiral exactly where to set his ambush. It was won by a commander who trusted his codebreakers over the objections of Washington. It was won by the sacrifice of torpedo bomber crews who flew to certain death and unknowingly cleared the sky for the dive bombers that followed them. And it was won by a simple, elegant trick involving a fake message about broken water pipes on a tiny coral atoll in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. 1,121 sailors died aboard the battleship Mutsu a year after Midway in a mysterious magazine explosion at the Hashirajima anchorage. Mutsu had fired her main guns in anger only once during the entire war, at a reconnaissance aircraft during the Battle of the Eastern Solomons in August of 1942. The great battleships of the Second World War were rendered obsolete by the very weapons that decided the Battle of Midway. Aircraft launched from carriers guided by intelligence that no amount of armor could deflect. The age of the battleship died in those 5 minutes on the morning of June 4, 1942. The age of information warfare was born. Today, the wrecks of Kaga and Akagi rest on the floor of the Pacific, more than 16,000 feet below the surface. They were located by the research vessel Petrel in October of 2019, their hulls still bearing the scars of the bombs that ended their careers. Soryu and Hiryu have never been found. Yorktown was located by Robert Ballard in 1998, upright on the ocean floor, her flight deck still largely intact. These ships are war graves, monuments to the men of both nations who fought and died in the battle that turned the tide of the Pacific War. Rochefort's dungeon beneath Pearl Harbor still exists. The basement room where a handful of exhausted men broke the code that changed history is preserved as a historic site. It is a small, plain space, unremarkable in every way except for what happened within its walls. No dramatic last stand, no heroic charge, just men with pencils and tabulating machines and an unbreakable determination to crack an unbreakable code. The lesson of Midway is that wars are not always won by the side with the most ships or the biggest guns. Sometimes they are won by the side that listens, that thinks, that sees through the enemy's deceptions while crafting deceptions of its own. Chester Nimitz understood this. Joseph Rochefort proved it. And Isoroku Yamamoto, one of the most brilliant naval strategists of the 20th century, learned it at the cost of his fleet, his reputation, and ultimately his life. In the end, the most powerful weapon at Midway was not a bomb or a torpedo. It was a message, intercepted, decoded, and acted upon with the courage to bet everything on the work of a man in a smoking jacket standing in a basement, reading secrets that were never meant to be read.